Okay, so hi everyone. In this session, we want to give a little bit of an overview of natural capital concepts, the relationship between natural capital and biodiversity, and an overview of the natural capital accounting process. And we'll use some examples from the in-case project, and then finish the session at the end with a little bit of an overview of the policy landscape into which all of this sits. My name's Jane Stout. I'm a professor in Trinity College Dublin and have been involved in Natural Capital Ireland since its initiation in 2014. So when we start with the question of what is natural capital, and natural capital is pretty much everything in the environment. So when we think about natural capital, it's all the living part of the environment, the biosphere, but it's also the non-living part of the environment. And I've tried to depict this in this diagram here, where we've got the biosphere at the bottom, but we've also got the geosphere, the hydrosphere, the atmosphere, and the cryosphere. So the cryosphere is the frozen part of the planet. And natural capital is all of this. So natural capital is an economic metaphor for all of this living and non-living environment in which we live. And the natural capital approach is really about thinking about this environment, this natural capital, as a stock from which we get flows of benefits and services. So natural capital concept is basically an economic metaphor. It's borrowing the language of economics and business to try and illustrate the importance of the natural environment, the living and non-living natural environment, to people. So it's to try and link the environment and economy and society. So we think about nature, all of our environment, all our natural resources, including biodiversity, living organisms, the rocks, the soil, the sun, the rain. This is our stock or our asset. And together, the soil, the nutrients, the sun and the rain, they allow the production of biomass, the growth of crops that can produce marketable goods, which can feed into economic activity. So we get flows of goods and services from this stock of nature. But it's not just these marketable goods and services that we get from nature. So it's not just about the growth of biomass and the sale of food. We get lots of other benefits from these healthy functioning ecosystems. So we get these ecosystems, they do their thing, there's interactions between organisms within that ecosystem, and then we get various benefits in terms of water purification and attenuation, in terms of recreational and cultural and aesthetic benefits, and things like regulating services like pollination and predation. So this is what the natural capital concept is all about. It's thinking about nature in terms of stocks, in terms of assets that then benefits and services flow from. So if we look at these natural habitats, we can start to think about the kinds of services, and each habitat provides, you know, each habitat doesn't provide all of those services, each habitat provides some of those services. And really the natural capital approach has been used to try and bring this idea of the importance of the natural environment into our business and into our economic thinking and into our decision making. And we're very familiar with produced capital, we're very familiar with human capital, and the idea about thinking about nature in this way is so that we can think about natural capital and its interactions between these other kinds of capital. And these figures actually come from the Dasgupta review of the economics of biodiversity. And they really illustrate, you know, the one on the left shows that, you know, the interactions between natural and human and produced capital. And the one on the right really shows that this natural capital underpins the human and the produced capital that drive and sustain the economy. So natural capital, the natural capital concept is about bringing the environment into decision making. And one of the reasons for doing this, and this is another figure from the Dasgupta review, is that our recent increases in wealth and well-being, and our increases in produced capital and human capital have come at the expense of natural capital. So we can see over the last 30 years, we've seen a huge increase in well-being in terms of produced capital, an increase in human capital, but a decline in natural capital. And lots of people equate the natural capital approach with with valuing nature or putting a price on nature. And the natural capital approach isn't about putting a price on nature, it's about recognizing and valuing nature, and that's a different thing. So the approach is about using the language of economics and business to bring the environment, the living, the non-living aspects of our natural capital into our decision making. So how does biodiversity fit in? So biodiversity as a concept, scientifically, it's biological diversity, it's the variety of life. We're talking about this variety from coastal grasslands to freshwater wetlands, uplands, wildflower meadows in urban areas. All of this comprises, that's the word I was looking for, comprises our biodiversity. And as scientists, we think about biodiversity at different levels of biological organization. So we think about biodiversity at the genetic level. Again, this is another figure from that Dasgupta review, so that's definitely some recommended reading. From the genetic point of view, we get biodiversity at the genetic level, whereby all the individuals within a population are genetically different. That's what makes every individual in a population different. So biodiversity at the genetic level, at the species level, all the different plants and animals and microorganisms that interact to make a biological community. And then that biological community interacts with the non-living system to create ecosystems that together create biomes that make up the biosphere. So this is how we think about biological organization as scientists, and biodiversity is the variety at all of those levels. And the biodiversity crisis, or the loss of biodiversity, is occurring because it's basically being squeezed out and destroyed and degraded by human activity. So when there's clearance for development, for building houses, for straightening roads, for agriculture, then there becomes an erosion of this diversity, and we end up with a very homogeneous, very highly managed environment. And so there's still nature there, there's still things growing, there's still green stuff, there's still organisms in that environment, but the diversity has been much reduced. And the global assessment of biodiversity that was published in 2019 showed that globally 75% of land area has been very significantly altered by human activity, that 2/3 of ocean areas are experiencing increasing impacts, and that nearly all of global wetland areas have been lost or destroyed. And with this loss of habitat diversity, with this degradation of habitat, with this loss of biodiversity at the habitat level, we're also seeing a loss of biodiversity at the species level. And so this graph shows the Living Planet Index, which is it's a measure of biodiversity based on vertebrate species, so animals with backbones. And it's shown relative to a baseline in 1970, how biodiversity at the species level has declined over the last 40 years or so. And this global report that was published in 2019 also showed that, as well as habitats being lost, that species are at risk as well. So it estimated that of the 8 million species that are currently on Earth, 1 million of those species are threatened with extinction, which is a huge proportion. 1 in 8 of the species on the planet today are threatened with extinction. In terms of biodiversity loss, this global trend is also true here in Ireland. Of the 31,500 species we have in Ireland, about 10% of those have been assessed for their conservation status. And here 1 in 5 of those species that have been assessed are at risk of extinction. So we've got a massive issue with biodiversity loss. And this biodiversity loss is being driven both at a national level and at an international level by these 5 main drivers. So this destruction of habitat, pollution and degradation of habitats and poisoning of organisms, overexploitation, so basically removing resources, biological resources, at a rate that exceeds their ability to regenerate. So basically our demand is exceeding our supply of natural resources. introductions of non-native species, and climate change. These are the main drivers of global biodiversity loss and the drivers of biodiversity loss here in Ireland. And the problem with this loss of biodiversity is that our ecosystems are then not as healthy, and they're not able to deliver these benefits, these so-called ecosystem services that we get from healthy biodiverse systems. And so ecosystem services are the outputs from functioning ecosystems that have benefits and values to society, to humanity. And they're often organized into these categories of supporting services at the bottom of the figure there. These are the services that all life on Earth really depends on. So recycling of nutrients, formation of soil, production of oxygen. Life as we know it wouldn't be here without these fundamental supporting services. And then there's the provisioning services shown in blue on this diagram. These are basically the goods, the things we extract from ecosystems and trade and sell on markets. So food, fuel, timber, medicinal compounds. There's the regulating services shown in green, and there's a huge number of regulating services that we get from healthy functioning ecosystems, from climate regulation, water regulation, attenuation of pollution, wildlife habitat, pollination, pest control, lots and lots of regulating services from ecosystems. And then finally, the last group of services there, the cultural services, are the aesthetic, the spiritual, the recreational and well-being benefits that we get from healthy functioning ecosystems. These ecosystem services have been classified by different people in different ways, but there's a common classification of ecosystem services that's used, and I'll come back to this when I talk about natural capital accounting in a minute, this common classification of ecosystem services, or SEEA-EA, which divides ecosystem services into these three of those categories that I mentioned previously: the provisioning, the regulating, and the cultural services. At the international level, the IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, has moved away from using this idea of ecosystem services and now really talks about nature's contributions to people. And they're more or less the same concept, but the wording and the terminology of nature's contributions to people includes both positive and negative. So previously people would talk about ecosystem services and disservices, but this sort of has been encapsulated by IPBES into this nature's contributions to people, but it's more or less the same thing. I just wanted to mention that this terminology is also being used, and one reason that it's being used is to bring in Indigenous knowledge and different worldviews, and there's been some analysis as to whether there's really any difference between the two concepts, and this study that I've cited on the slide here has found that in terms of diverse worldviews, context-specific perspective, relational values, then NCP, nature's contributions to people, is novel to ecosystem services. In terms of the state of ecosystem services, so this IPBES report in 2019 just gave information about the state of global biodiversity and the state of services. And I've just pulled out this figure here, which lists a bunch of ecosystem services, or nature's contributions to people, and what the 50-year global trends are. And you can see that the only services or contributions that have positive trends that are showing green upwards arrows or increase in terms of the global trend are those associated with goods, so energy, food, feed, materials. All the other benefits that we're getting from ecosystems are either in steep decline or are showing some kind of decline. So this shows us that we have an issue. Biodiversity is being lost, and we're seeing a downward trend in terms of the benefits to people. Just before I finish speaking about biodiversity, I think, one thing to address is whether diversity is actually important, because we know nature is important. We know that we get lots of benefits from trees, from different habitats, but is diversity itself actually important? And what ecologists have learned is that diversity in ecosystems gives them resilience. So there's a positive relationship between diversity and how well ecosystems work. So if there's more species, the system's more adaptable in the face of change, and it can bounce back from severe events more effectively. And research has also shown that biodiversity or high diversity in systems reduces the risk of disease in humans. This is very relevant given the last 2 years of the pandemic. And various pieces of research have shown that when you have an increased diversity, you have a decreased rate of infection, a decrease in the density or the prevalence of disease. And there's just a couple of examples on the slide there. From my own area of research, we've lots of studies that show that an increase in diversity of pollinators can increase pollination services. And so these graphs here are from global meta-analyses, bringing data together from all across the world, showing when you have more species of pollinator, you get an increase in pollination service. When you have more species of natural enemy, you get an increase in pest control service. And as you have an increase in the number of species, you get an increase in the functional diversity in the system. So you get a better delivery of ecosystem service. So that's biodiversity and why diversity is important in systems. The next thing I want to speak about is in terms of natural capital accounting. So I said the natural capital approach is about using the language of economics and business to bring the natural world, the living and the non-living natural world, into decision making. So natural capital accounting then is a specific approach to measuring these ecosystems and the benefits we get from them. If we think about our three capitals again, our produced capital is measured through the system of national accounts, so things like GDP, and we're all really familiar with the concept of GDP. Our human capital is measured in various ways through population data and through censuses, but until recently, there hasn't really been a systematic way to measure our natural capital. And that's what natural capital accounting does, is fills this gap of measuring, allowing us to measure and track change in natural capital. And I've put across the top of the slide there, if it's not measured, it's not managed. And that's what's happened, is that our natural capital hasn't been measured. This global assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services published in 2019 was the first time that any kind of global assessment like that had been done and published. So it hasn't been measured, which has meant that it hasn't been well managed. Now, just as I said that the natural capital approach was not about putting a price on nature, natural capital accounting is also not about putting a price on nature. It's about tracking change in natural capital stocks or assets, about tracking change in their quality or their condition, and about tracking change in the flows of services and benefits that we get from them. So we go back to this idea that our natural capital is a stock, is an asset from which we get flows of benefits and services, both marketable goods and products, but also these non-market services. Then natural capital accounting tries to capture both these stocks and these flows. And I think that's the important kind of terminology in this concept. There's, in terms of natural capital accounting, we reviewed the approaches to natural capital accounting in the in-case literature review, which is available online. But there's some key approaches that have become standard and that are being widely used. And one is from the Natural Capital Protocol, and the other is from the UN, from the System of Environmental Economic Accounting. But basically, it's the same thing. We're looking at our stocks, we're measuring those stocks, we're looking at the benefits that we get from them, and there's just the slight differences in the way that these two processes work, from the natural capital protocol and from the system of environmental economic accounting. Through the literature review for the InCase project, which is an EPA-funded research project, we were keen to do a spatially based natural capital accounting approach, because we were working at catchment scale, and so we decided to use the SEEA, the System of Environmental Economic Accounts, ecosystem accounting. And when we started, this was experimental ecosystem accounting. It's now become an international standard. And what this ecosystem accounting approach does is that it looks at the extent of assets or stocks, the condition of those assets or stocks, the services that are derived from those assets or stocks, and the benefits. And those benefits can be expressed in monetary terms, or they can be expressed in other units. So I'll just give a quick run through what we've done in the InCase project, just to illustrate what this approach means. So what we did in the InCase project, as I said, was work at catchment scale. So this figure here shows the Dargle catchment in North County Wicklow. And on the east side of the catchment is the Irish Sea. And on the west side of the catchment is the Wicklow Mountains. And the first step in this natural capital accounting is to understand the extent of the stocks of our natural capital assets. So this is a map of based on the careen land cover of the catchment area. And you can see in red there is the urban areas, and in the green we've got the moors, the heathlands, and the forests. So this allows us to, at a catchment scale, to understand the extent of the different assets of natural capital, and in this case different kinds of land covers. Now there's issues in determining asset extent. The careen land cover is a very coarse resolution, so it doesn't pick up all the details of small patches of habitat, which can be very important in terms of delivering services and benefits. So as well as this baseline of careen land cover, we then had to use lots and lots of other data sources to sort of layer up and fill in the gaps and fill in the details. And I've just put a couple of those data sources on this slide here. So we've got the small woody features data set, which allowed us to pick out those areas of woodland, small areas of woodland, small woody features that weren't picked up by the careen land cover mapping. And then also the second figure there is on soils. So, you know, we can have land cover, but what's going on underneath at the soil level. So we can get lots of different data sets and layer them up. There are challenges with that because different data sets are at different resolutions. They're collected on different timescales. They don't necessarily align particularly well. There's lots of gaps. Getting up-to-date data sets is very difficult, etc. So even though the asset extent can be, you know, thought of as the sort of the simple part of the process, it depends at what scale you're working as to how simple it is. The next thing then is to look at the condition of those assets. So this map here shows for the subcatchments in the Dargle area, the condition of those assets based on assessment for the Water Framework Directive. So based on the condition of these ecosystems as they've been reported for the Water Framework Directive. And so we can see that some of these are at risk and some of these are considered not at risk. So very broad brush interpretation of condition. And we published a paper that from the SEEA project, which describes this approach, from the InCase project, which describes this approach using the SEEA-EA on development of extent and condition accounts. And we use the Dargle as an example in this paper. So if you want any more detail, then please do have a look at that. And I think the point that we make in this paper is that condition is really, really hard to get data on. So we really only got condition data from the Water Framework Directive. You can see it's very broad brush. It's not very highly resolved. And internationally, condition accounts are the least developed. They're much more difficult to get information on, because we know something about our asset extent. As I said, that's hard enough to get information on, but knowing the condition of those assets is difficult. And of course, the condition varies according to which service you're interested in as well. So condition might be good in terms of a provisioning service. So you might have a field with perennial ryegrass producing lots of biomass, which gives you lots of provisioning or fodder services, but that condition isn't good if you're measuring biodiversity, for example. So condition is a really tricky part of the process. In terms of services then, so for each of the assets or the habitat types in the area for which you're doing the ecosystem accounting, for each of those habitat types of those ecosystems, you can generate a list of services and a list of beneficiaries, and basically tick off which services are being provided by which areas. And I know this is terribly small on the screen, but this is a table from that paper that I just mentioned. Actually, it's not. It's a table from another paper. It's a table from a paper where we used peatlands as an example for how to go from condition to services, and to look at this issue of what kind of services are coming from our peatlands. And so if you have really good eyesight and you can see these slides, you can see that we've got a list of service flows from peatlands, we've got a list of benefits from those service flows, and we've got a list of likely beneficiaries. And then what we did in this piece of work from the InCase project in this paper was to develop a risk register. So that was basically looking at each of those services, looking at the condition of the asset for delivery of those services, and assessing whether it was at risk or not. And this risk register, so we've coloured it here. So red is at risk, and green not at risk, and orange intermediate. And we also then gave some management advice. So the whole point of this natural capital accounting process is to inform management decision making. And so this risk register allows us to identify which of the services are at risk according to the condition of the habitat, and then we can make management recommendations. So for example, in terms of provisioning services, in terms of grazing biomass, in the Dargle, this was seen to be at intermediate risk, and so the recommendation is to reduce or to eliminate grazing. So that's how these ecosystem accounts can be used in a management context. In terms of the last step of the ecosystem accounting here, in terms of determining benefits, we didn't go as far as calculating a monetary value for these ecosystem services for these catchments. There are lots of ways you can create a monetary value using various metrics that I'm not going to go into today, but you can also express those benefits in other terms as well. It doesn't have to be a monetary value, but it is quite useful to convert the value of nature into a financial value, because it really makes that value stand out. So it's a metric that everyone understands. Not everybody understands tons of carbon or litres of water or even numbers of birds, but people do understand financial values. So it can be useful to create these financial accounts, so to apply a monetary value to draw attention to particular issues, to reveal the scale of problems or issues that are there, or risks that are upcoming. And as I say, it's a tangible metric that people do understand. I just want to finish off just by mentioning natural capital in international policy. So natural capital, the concept, the approach, and natural capital accounting is something that has become very prevalent in policy at international level. So in terms of EU strategies and directives. It's the ambition to protect, conserve and enhance natural capital is in the Environment Action Programme, it's in the EU Biodiversity Strategy, and it's in terms, excuse me, in terms of natural capital accounting, the Non-Financial Reporting Directive states that certain companies should engage in non-financial reporting, so reporting on environmental policies, risks and outcomes, and this can include an element of natural capital accounting. At the global level, the Sustainable Development Goals include a target to integrate ecosystem and biodiversity values into national and local planning and development processes, poverty reduction strategies and accounts. So there was a target in the SDGs to do this by 2020. That target hasn't necessarily been met by every country, but countries are now starting to incorporate ecosystems and biodiversity value into accounts, start this process of natural capital accounting. And the Aichi targets also required this approach to natural capital accounting. Obviously, with the development of the new global framework for biodiversity, we expect there to be more of this in the targets for 2030. At the European level, the EU Green Deal stated a very ambitious commitment to all EU policies contributing to preserving and restoring Europe's natural capital by integrating ecosystems and their services into decision making. So this isn't explicitly saying that we should use ecosystem accounting, but ecosystem accounting would seem like a sensible way to meet this ambition. At the national level, the Irish Programme for Government includes commitments to protecting biodiversity and natural heritage, and the Biodiversity Action Plan includes a goal to develop natural capital asset register, natural capital accounts, and to integrate them into policy and decision making. Now, this is the last National Biodiversity Action Plan, which is currently being revised, and a new action plan is being drafted and will be published during 2022. There's lots of other mentions of natural capital in national policy and national objectives. So this concept of natural capital and the use of the terminology and the use of the natural capital accounting process is something that is growing, is becoming more and more prevalent. And so having an appreciation of how to do it and when it's appropriate to do it and what it is becoming increasingly important. I'll just finish there with the links for Natural Capital Ireland, where you can get further information.